Okay, so public choice, part C. We ended part B talking about rational ignorance. So to continue on, let's assume that the median voter theory holds. One of the things we might want to do is look at how that would apply to, let's say, a vote on some kind of a public good. We'll talk about public goods more when we get to common resources, externality, and public goods. But let me first explain what we mean by a public good. A public good is a good that's non-excludable and non-rival in consumption. So, an example of a public good could be like national defense, or it could be a public park, or it might be a statue, or something along those lines. So let's imagine that there's a vote that's going to take place. And to simplify things, let's imagine that there are 7 people who are going to be voting on things. And let's imagine that the vote that's going to take place is on the amount of a public good, this thing that's non-excludable and non-rival. Maybe it's the size of a public park, or maybe it's it's how much money is going to get spent on a statue or something along those lines. And people have different opinions as to how much should be spent on this public good. So imagine that down in this end, Alan and Barry don't want to spend a lot. They want to spend maybe one or two, and then Frank and Gwen think that we should spend more on this public good. The story that we're going to tell is that at the end of the day, the only voter that is going to get the amount of this spent on this public good that they want is Denise, because she's the median voter. So let's go ahead and let's think about what happens when this kind of a vote like this is going to take place. Now I realize 7 people is not a lot, but you could expand this to 7,000 people or 7 million people, and it's more or less the same process. So imagine that because Alan and Barry are kind of small government types, Alan knows that Barry is a small government type like him, and he talks to him and says, "Hey, there's a vote coming up on this public good, and whatever it happens to be, and I think the right amount of money to spend is one." And then Barry says, "Well, yeah, I don't want to spend too much on it, but I think one is too little. I think the right amount is two." So Alan thinks about it for a while and he says, I don't agree with Barry, but if I do agree to spend two, then we've got 2 votes. And what we need is four. So maybe what I'll do just for the sake of getting to 4 votes is agree to two, so that now we can go hit up some other people so that we can convince them that two is the right amount. So let's say Alan says, okay, I think two is the right amount. Let's go talk to Catherine. Catherine is another small government type. So then they knock on her door and they say, hey, this vote's coming up and we're trying to figure out how much to spend on this public good. And Alan and Barry say, we've agreed on two. And then Catherine says, yeah, that seems like it's a little bit too small. I think the right amount to spend is three. So then just imagine that Alan and Barry caucus with each other and they say, well, let's see, are we really set at two, or are we trying to stop those wackos, Ellen, Frank, and Gwen, from spending seven? And they agree that three is a more reasonable amount. If they agree to three, they have 3 votes. All they need to do is get one more, and they know whose door they're going to knock on next. So let's say that Alan, Barry, Catherine agree that three is the right amount to spend on this public good. And now what they do is knock on Denise's door, because Denise is kind of right in the middle, and they pitch their case as to why three is the right amount to spend. Denise is not entirely convinced. She says, yeah, I would feel more comfortable with four. So then maybe what happens is Alan, Barry, Catherine caucus on it a little bit, and they say, you know what, if we agree to four, at least we won't be spending seven like those crazy Ellen, Frank, and Gwen. Let's agree to four. And so they do. Is Alan getting the amount he wants? No, he wanted one, and he's agreed to four. What about Barry? Well, Barry wanted two, and he's agreed to four. And Catherine wanted three, and she's agreed to four. And we could we could go through the same thought process if we started with Gwen, Frank, and Ellen. If Gwen were to talk to Frank, maybe even though she thinks the right amount to spend is seven, maybe she'd agree to six, just to keep Alan and Barry somehow from winning. And they would be moving in this direction. They'd talk to Ellen next, and then finally they'd land on four, because that's what's going to get them 4 votes instead of something more extreme. Now, a lot of people look at this and say, well, that's terrible, and that's because people are compromising. We cannot compromise. What we have to do is dig in. So just imagine that Alan, Barry, and Catherine do that. They engage in the strategy and they say, you know what, no compromise. We're not going to give in. We're going to stake out the most extreme position. We believe in small government, so we think the right amount is zero. We shouldn't be spending anything on this. And then Ellen, Frank, and Gwen say, no, 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 we think we believe in more public spending. We believe the government should spend more money than that, and we're not going to compromise either. We're going to stake our claim at 7. According to the median voter theory, the amount that is actually going to be spent is 4. Why is that? Because if you've got 3 votes for 0 and 3 votes for 7, nobody's got a majority. Somebody needs to get Denise. And if Denise wants 4, then they're all going to agree on 4 in order to prevent the other side from winning. So if the median voter theory holds, then the only person that gets the amount of a public good that they want is the median voter, and everybody else is kind of stuck with whatever their choice is. Now, you looked at that and say, well, that's kind of a normal distribution. What would happen if the amount that we wanted to spend on a public good varied? Well, the same thing according to the median voter theory. So imagine we were voting on the amount of money that was going to get spent on defense. We don't do that, but just imagine that we did. Imagine that 25% of the population believe that we should just unilaterally disarm and spend 0. Imagine that 5% of the population believes that we should spend more than 200 billion. Imagine that 10% of the population believes that we should spend 50 billion and 40% of the population thinks that we should spend 150 billion. Well, if you look at these numbers, you realize that nobody has a majority. So what do they have to do? They have to agree. If we were actually voting on this, they'd have to agree to 100 billion because that's where the median voter stands, and that's where the compromise would have to take place. So that's another example of where maybe the median voter gets what they want and everybody else doesn't. All right, now, what about voting for things and looking at it in terms of efficiency? So what do we mean by efficiency? What we mean is we compare the costs and the benefits, and if the cost is greater than the benefit, we wouldn't do that. If, on the other hand, the benefit is greater than cost, then we would do that. So let's imagine, again, we've got a vote coming up on some public good. If this thing passes, everybody is going to be taxed, let's say $100. We'll make it, this will be like a flat tax. Maybe it's to build a statue or something like that in a community. And imagine that there are people who have different values for this. So let's just imagine that the people who value it least are Janowitz, Isley, and Harris. They think this is a dumb idea. So if you ask them, well, how much do you value the statue? They might say, I don't know, $10. So if we build a statue, you're going to get taxed $100. They would vote against it. Why is that? Because they don't think this is worth much at all. It's maybe worth $10 to them, and if they have to spend 100, they have a net negative benefit. So obviously they're going to vote against it. Then you have some other people who think this is great. We should be spending money on it. People like Applebaum and Browning and Carson. Like Applebaum values a statue, let's say, at $150. So if they went ahead and passed this and they taxed him $100, he feels like that would be money good spent, well spent. You know, he's getting a $50 net benefit, so he would vote for this statue. Same thing with Browning. Browning feels that he values a statue, let's say, at $140. If it cost him $100 to get it built, he would have a net benefit of 40, so he would vote for that as well. So what we're trying to do is look at how many people would vote for it based on their individual cost and benefit. Everybody's got the same cost, but people's benefits are going to vary perhaps. So what we see over here is we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 votes in favor and 1, 2, 3, 4 against. So this thing is going to pass. But then if we add up the individual benefits, we would get what we call the social benefit. And if we add up the individual costs, we'd get the social cost. Well, individuals would never do a rational individual anyway, wouldn't do anything where the benefit is less than the cost. But it turns out when we're talking about things that happen in the public domain, a lot of times we will act when the benefit of something is actually less than the cost. Because if we sum up the individual benefits to get the social benefit, it's only 812. If we sum up the individual costs to get the social cost, it's 1,000. So on balance, this is actually something that wouldn't fly, but yet it's going to win because it's got 6 votes out of 10. Condorcet voting paradox. What is that all about? The order in public choice theory, we believe that the order of the vote should not matter. It turns out in reality it does matter. So I'm not going to test you on this, but just imagine that we're voting, let's say, on a location of a new airport, and let's say there's 3 types of voters who have different preferences. It turns out in what we call pairwise voting, where you have to vote on things 2 at a time, that the order of the vote makes a difference. And you might be led to believe, let's say, if we were lining up, let's say these are our locations for a new airport, San Marcos, Kearny Mesa, or the border. It turns out that, based on these types of voters, that people prefer San Marcos over Kearny Mesa. How do we know that? 35% of voters are type 1 and they prefer San Marcos over Kearny Mesa, and 20% are type 3 who also prefer San Marcos over Kearny Mesa. So it seems like that would if we pair these up first and then they went up against the border, we could see how that would shake out, right? But if we look at other people, let's say how type 1 and type 2 voters compare in terms of Kearny Mesa versus the border. Type 1 voters prefer Kearny Mesa over the border, so do type 2 voters. And so when we go ahead and maybe run them against in one election and then go up against San Marcos, we'd get a different ordering. Again, I'm not going to test you on this, and I doubt I'm going to do the board work, which I would normally do in class to show you what we're talking about. But my point is this: politicians know that the order of the vote matters. And oftentimes, when they want a particular outcome, when they want to make it seem like the people voted on something and that is the will of the people, they will schedule votes, pairwise votes, in such a way that they get the outcome that they want. That's all I'm going to say about the Condorcet voting paradox. Arrow's impossibility theorem, I'm definitely not going to test you on this. Kenneth Arrow won half a Nobel Prize in economics for, among other things, developing a mathematical proof that showed that any voting system, and there's different types. We tend to have simple majority voting systems, but there's also supermajority where maybe you have to get 67% or 75% board account. Whatever voting system you want will not give us all the things that we want out of a voting system. So what is it that we generally want? We want unanimity, we want transitivity, we want our irrelevant alternatives to be independent of one another. Turns out they're not. And we definitely don't want dictators making choices on our behalf. So no matter what system we choose, we're not going to get all of these things that are desirable in the voting system. So what that means is, yeah, it's probably better that we vote on issues and our elected officials and having somebody else impose that on us. But does that mean we get what we want? And the answer is probably not. All right, rent seeking versus profit. There's going to be a lot of talk about this in the election, at least profit. We've got a lot of candidates that think that people who have made a lot of money by coming up with products and things that we all use, that's a bad thing, that their profit should be taxed away from them. So we kind of have an idea, maybe as we go through life, what we mean by profit. Profit is when you sell something at a higher price than what it cost you to make. What is rent seeking? Rent seeking is when you make yourself better off without necessarily making society better off. So you've got control over some kind of resource, and you get a payment on that resource that's higher than the opportunity cost would be for that resource. So a lot of people engage in rent-seeking activity through the political process. Maybe what you do is you influence politicians to tilt the table so things are more favored. Things kind of fall into your lap because the table isn't, we don't have a level playing field. We get the politicians to do something that makes us better off, but isn't necessarily going to make society better off. So we have a graph for that. We have a graph for just about everything in economics. And this is the graph that I'm going to use to demonstrate the difference between what happens when people engage in rent-seeking opportunities and the outcomes that society's left with. So let's imagine we have a situation where we've only got two people in society. We've got Smith and we've got Jones. And between them, they make income of $10,000. In other words, they're working together, and between the two of them, they're going to make $10,000, but maybe the income is not evenly distributed. Sound familiar? I mean, we're hearing a lot about the one percenters and the people at the top. So just imagine a situation where Smith gets 90% of the income. So in other words, this income line over here represents $10,000 and Smith is getting 9,000, which means that Jones is only left with $1,000. That doesn't seem fair, or at least Jones wouldn't think it's fair. So maybe what Jones says is, look, that's not equitable. That's not something that's fair. I don't want to take all of Smith's money away, but I think we should redistribute the income in such a way that I get a little bit more. I'm not asking for 50% of the income, but give me 3,000. Smith would still be left with 7,000. How could that be? How could he complain about that? Well, one reason he might complain about that is because the status quo, the way things stand without any income redistribution, is that Smith gets 90% of the income, 9,000, and maybe he contributes more. And then Jones would say, yes, I know Smith contributes more, but what I'm saying is he doesn't contribute that much more that he deserves 90%. He's still going to get 7,000. But if Smith fights that, and then Jones fights that, and they both keep fighting against each other instead of working with each other, instead of the income line staying here at 10,000 or maybe even shifting out, because there's so much fighting, the income line actually shifts in. So let's imagine now that we're on this $9,000 income line because these two people aren't working with each other, they're fighting with each other. And by the way, if that sounds far-fetched, maybe some of you might know somebody, maybe somebody else, a friend of yours or other person who's gone through a divorce, like a nasty divorce. And maybe you've got, a mom and a dad that are both working and they're making a lot of money when they're working together. But then as they're going through this nasty divorce, they have to take a lot of time off from what they do to fight the other person. So both their incomes go down as they're going through the divorce process, right? Because you've got the attorney for the wife, let's say, don't do that. You need to take every dollar you can out of it. And then you've got the attorney for the husband saying, don't let her do that. That's your money. And so they're the only people who are getting rich in this whole process are the attorneys, right? So let's just imagine the income line shifts to on the inside. Now we're on a $9,000 income line, and let's imagine that when everything's all said and done, instead of being over here at A, we're over here at D. Now, some people would say D is actually a better outcome for Smith, and they say, why is that? Well, when we were over here on this income line, Smith had 90% of the money. If you look at how 85% compares to 9,000, D is actually a higher percentage. Just imagine that Smith winds up with 8,500 divided by 9,000, whatever percentage that works out to be. That's a higher percentage than he has over here at A. But is Smith really a winner? And an economist would say no, because he's getting 8,500 before he was getting 9,000. So what if he has a higher percentage? He has a higher percentage of a smaller pie. He's not better off. And then let's say that Jones doesn't get what he wants. Jones thinks that it would be equitable, it would be fair for him to get 3,000. Let's say he only gets 2,500. Is Jones better off? And the answer is yeah, of course he was, because before he was only getting 1,000, now he's getting 2,500. Gee, would this create a situation where Jones would always complain about something or other? I mean, if the way to more money is to just take it away from Smith, then there's pretty much no end to this process. Jones will continue doing that. So even if he doesn't get what he wants, if he gets anything more, there's no end to this. This is going to continue. Regulatory capture. So, what's the idea behind regulatory capture? The regulatory capture is the idea that sometimes a industry or a business or a company that is regulated winds up taking over for the regulator. In other words, this regulator is supposed to be a watchdog. Instead, what happens is over time, this regulating agency becomes a lapdog. And so the agency winds up doing the bidding for the companies that it's regulating. So, an example of that could be, this is kind of a more local one. A few years back, SDG&E, which is a regulated utility, the people there were found to be communicating outside of normal channels with the people at the Public Utilities Commission. And so it seemed like they had a backdoor or a channel outside of the normal regulatory process. And a lot of times, what you'll notice with, say, public utilities is that whenever they ask for a rate increase, they kind of get it. Now, some people would say maybe they deserve it, maybe they don't. But the point I'm trying to make is there's the possibility that the regulatory agency, instead of being this watchdog and making sure that the company's doing what they're supposed to be doing, winds up being a lapdog. Or how about this one? This is a more recent example. Boeing and the FAA. So the FAA and airplane manufacturers over time have become have had better relationships. One where the FAA kind of takes the word of the airline manufacturer because the airline manufacturer knows more about the plane. Well, then we had an issue with the new 737 MAX, and it turned out that the FAA, instead of looking at what Boeing was doing, was just kind of taking their word for it. And then they got embarrassed after a couple crashes, and now it looks like they're saying, okay, well, we can't let this go on. Well, why did it happen in the first place? It probably happened in the first place because the FAA and Boeing, the regulatory agency and the company, got too cozy, and the regulators stopped doing their job. So that's an example of regulatory capture. There's other examples. For example, right before the Deepwater Horizon mishap in 2008, it turned out that a lot of the people in the Minerals Management Agency and BP were too cozy with one another. Another example could be if you look at the financial crisis. There were all these different regulatory agencies, including the SEC, that didn't seem to notice what was going on, or, the financial crisis caught everybody by surprise. But yet we've got, and this is not an exaggeration, if you count state and federal agencies regulating finance and insurance, there's 435 agencies. So how come none of those agencies were able to see that we were heading for a disaster going into the Great Recession, the financial crisis? Also, another example could be there was a time when the airlines were regulated by a government agency called the Civil Aeronautics Board. And it turns out that during this period of time, it ended in the late 1970s, very few new airlines started up. And part of the reason was because the Civil Aeronautics Board had the authority to determine whether or not a new airline should start. In other words, it wasn't market conditions, it was this government agency. So they were kind of captured by the airlines, and they did the work for the airlines of keeping new competitors out. Or, you think about the FCC and the industries that they regulate. A lot of times it seems like they're not really doing much to make sure that these media companies are in fact playing by the rules. They seem to be doing their bidding. So these are examples of regulatory capture. All right, so let's talk a little bit about special interest groups. A lot of people don't like the fact that their vote seems to be outweighed by special interest groups. So one example of special interest groups is maybe you join an organization where all the people in the organization have the same political views, because you know that your one vote all by itself is not going to matter. So maybe you join the Sierra Club because the environment is important to you, or maybe you join the Chamber of Commerce because business issues are important to you. So all of these are examples of special interest groups. Another example that's maybe a little bit more disturbing is the way that legislative districts are drawn in most parts of the country. In California, under Schwarzenegger, there was a change. It used to be that the legislators and the congressmen and those people had veto over how the maps were drawn, and they came up with a special commission that does that, and very little ways for the elected officials to overturn that. But in most parts of the states, most parts of the United States, these district boundary lines are drawn by people who are trying to maximize the number of seats for one party or the other. And then when you think about the way legislative districts behave, oftentimes people in certain legislative districts get together with people in other legislative districts so that they can have more power, and that way their interests are advocated more forcefully than others. And that brings us to a thing called log rolling. So log rolling is this process that takes place where maybe one group of congressmen will decide that, I'll support your what you want to put in a bill if you support what I want to put in a bill. And what you see is more and more stuff going into a bill, and it's questionable as to whether or not it's something that's really necessary. So these are examples of special interest groups. All right, so let's talk about the difference between public institutions and private institutions. I work for, as you know, MiraCosta College, which is a public institution, but I didn't always work for a public institution. I've had two businesses and I've worked for two Fortune 500 companies, and I can assure you that public institutions and private institutions don't act the same way. In a private institution, especially if it's your own business, you're looking to maximize profit. You're trying to make as much money as you possibly can by being as efficient as you possibly can. When you look at the way government agencies run, that's not necessarily the case. So why don't public institutions behave more like private institutions? Well, there's some differences. A public institution receives funding from the legislature. So the amount of money that they get to spend is determined maybe not by them, but by something like the California legislature, or maybe it might be through some formula based on taxes collected from a district or something like that. There's no profits to maximize. When I hear politicians say, "I wish we could get government to operate more like a business," hey, I'm totally on board. But guess what? Government is not the same as business. Businesses maximize profits. Government has no profit to maximize. So how are you going to get these people to use money more efficiently? A government institution is not owned by people who can transfer ownership. So, take the DMV, for instance. Who owns the DMV? Well, theoretically, the people of California. But can we then transfer ownership to somebody else who might be able to take the DMV and transform it and do something so that they could become more efficient? The answer is no. It's a government agency. Often a public institution doesn't have to compete against anyone for the services they provide. Again, going back to the DMV, especially if you were in the line like I was for about 6, 7 hours for real ID. Why couldn't I go to another government agency to get my real ID? Well, because there's only one place that issues driver's licenses, right? They have no competition. And then there's an incentive to live on long past its usefulness. So, there's all these government agencies that are out there, and you may not encounter them, and you say, well, what do they do? And not very many people know. Is anybody who works in these government agencies going to raise their hand and say, "Hey, guess what? We're not needed anymore. Just wind us down"? And the answer is no. They probably won't. So, public institutions and private institutions behave very, very differently, or motivate people very, very differently. This is important because we don't necessarily think that people who work in the public sector are bad compared to people who work in the private sector. It's just that they have different motivations. They're operating under different institutional constraints. So we shouldn't be surprised that a government agency that doesn't have any competitive pressure is going to behave differently. And we also shouldn't be surprised that employees who work for an institution that doesn't have any competitive pressure is going to behave differently than the private sector. This is important because when you think about people who work for government, they're going to behave differently. They don't have a profit motive. They don't have maybe anybody that's going to monitor them on a regular basis. Yeah, they have a boss. yes, there's a chain of command, but at the end of the day, there's probably a lot of room for, especially if you can't get fired, for you to maybe do things at your own pace if you're a government bureaucrat. There's no incentive to provide good customer service because it's not like people have anywhere else to go. And what you're going to do is you're going to, if you work for a government agency, you're going to lobby for your continued existence, even if they don't need you anymore. You're certainly going to go out and vote. You're more likely to vote if you're a government worker than you are if you're not. So they will behave differently than people in the private sector. All right, folks, that is public choice. Thank you very much, and we will continue on.